What kind of job pays a man $200 to sit in a room and do absolutely nothing? The question stayed in Marcus Reed's mind as he stood outside the glass doors, fingers resting lightly on the folded paper in his hand, the address printed in clean black ink that smelled faintly of fresh toner. Too fresh for something that was supposed to be routine, too precise for something that was supposed to be simple. And yet there he was, a single father who had learned long ago not to ask too many questions when the rent was due in 3 days, and his son needed new sneakers before Monday morning, the kind with real cushioning, not the worn-out pair that squeaked on every hallway floor at school. So Marcus pushed the door open without hesitation, stepping into a lobby that felt quieter than it should have been. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but watching. The kind that made you aware of your own footsteps, measured and steady against polished marble that reflected too much light. Too clean, too perfect, like no one ever really lived there, only passed through it. And the woman at the front desk didn't look up right away, her fingers finishing a line of typing before her eyes lifted just enough to register him. Not fully, just enough to confirm he was there. And then she nodded toward the hallway without a word, as if he had already been categorized, processed, and dismissed in the same breath. Marcus didn't take it personally. He rarely did. Not anymore. Not after years of walking into rooms where people decided who he was before he ever spoke. So he simply nodded back and followed the direction, his jacket brushing softly against his side, worn but clean, carrying the faint scent of laundry detergent and long days. The hallway stretched longer than expected, lined with doors that looked identical, each one closed, each one silent, until he reached the last one, slightly ajar, as if someone had meant to close it but didn't, and inside was the room, the one from the instructions. A waiting room, except it didn't feel like waiting, not really. The furniture was too carefully arranged, the lighting too even, the air carrying a subtle coolness that hummed softly through unseen vents, and there was a clock on the wall, but the second hand didn't move. Marcus noticed that immediately, not because he was looking for it, but because stillness has a way of announcing itself when everything else is quiet. He stepped inside anyway, placing his bag gently beside the chair near the wall, not the center one, never the center one. He preferred edges, angles, places where he could see without being seen too much, and he sat down slowly, elbows resting lightly on his knees, hands loosely folded, not tense, just present, like a man who had spent years learning how to wait without letting waiting change him. Outside the room, somewhere beyond the hallway, a distant elevator chimed once, and then fell silent again. Marcus didn't reach for his phone, didn't check the time, didn't fill the quiet with noise. He simply breathed, steady, controlled, the kind of breathing that came from long nights helping a child fall asleep after a bad dream. The kind that carried patience without effort, and minutes passed. Or maybe they didn't, the clock didn't say. And then the door opened just enough to let someone in, a woman, mid-30s maybe, heels in one hand, the other brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she stepped inside, like she wasn't supposed to be there, like she had wandered in by accident or maybe by design, her posture straight but tired, the kind of tired that doesn't show on the surface until you're no longer performing for anyone. She didn't look at him right away, just moved toward the far side of the room and sat down, exhaling softly as if the air itself had weight. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because they couldn't, but because there was nothing that needed to be said yet. Marcus noticed the faint crease between her brows, the way her fingers tightened slightly around the shoes before relaxing again. And without thinking too much about it, he reached for the glass pitcher on the small table beside him, poured water into a cup, and set it gently within her reach. Not too close, not too far, just enough. She glanced at it, then at him, her eyes sharp for a second, measuring, calculating, as if expecting something else to follow. But nothing did. Marcus leaned back slightly, hands returning to rest, gaze drifting toward the still clock on the wall, calm, unchanged, and the room settled again into silence, thicker now, but not uncomfortable, just waiting, like something unseen had just begun. The woman did not reach for the water right away, and that small delay carried more weight than words ever could, like she was deciding whether the gesture meant something or nothing at all, her eyes lingering on the glass before finally lifting to meet his, not with warmth, not with hostility, but with a kind of quiet scrutiny that felt practiced, almost clinical, and Marcus held that gaze for a second longer than most people would. Not challenging, not submissive, just steady, the way a man looks when he has nothing to prove and nothing to hide. Then he looked away first, not out of discomfort, but out of respect for the space between them. And she noticed that too. The way his attention moved without lingering where it did not belong. The way he returned to stillness like it was his natural state, not something he was performing. And that seemed to unsettle her more than if he had spoken, because silence, real silence, leaves no place to project assumptions. She picked up the glass slowly, the faint clink of her ring against the rim echoing slightly in the quiet room, and took a small sip, her shoulders easing just a fraction, barely visible, but enough to mark a shift. Then she set the glass back down, exactly where it had been, precise, controlled, as if every movement was measured against something unseen. Marcus did not comment, did not nod, did not acknowledge the gesture at all, and that absence of reaction lingered, stretching the moment into something that felt longer than it should have been. She leaned back in her chair, one leg crossing over the other, shoe still in her hand, and studied him again, this time more openly. "You always this quiet?" she asked, her voice low, carrying a hint of something that could have been curiosity or testing or both. Marcus let the question settle for a second before answering. "Only when there is nothing that needs to be said," his tone even, unhurried, the kind of answer that did not invite argument but did not close the door either, and she tilted her head slightly, as if recalibrating, like the script she had expected was not the one unfolding in front of her. "Most people try to fill the silence," she said, almost to herself, and Marcus gave a small shrug. "Most people are uncomfortable with it," he replied, and that was it. No follow-up, no attempt to impress, just a statement left where it landed, and she let out a quiet breath that sounded closer to a laugh than anything else, but softer, restrained, like she had forgotten how to let it fully form. The room shifted again, not physically, but in the way tension rearranges itself when expectations are not met. She set her shoes down beside her chair now, no longer gripping them, her posture loosening in small, almost reluctant increments. "So they told you to sit here all night?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes watching closely. Marcus nodded once. "That is what the paper said," he answered, and she leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on her knees, mirroring the way he had been sitting earlier, though she did not seem to realize it. "And you did not ask why?" she pressed, and Marcus shook his head gently. "I get paid to do a job, not to question it," he said, then after a brief pause added, "unless it gives me a reason to." And something in that last line caught her attention, a subtle edge that had not been there before, not sharp, not defensive, just present, like a boundary drawn without needing to be announced. She studied him more carefully now, the quiet man in a worn jacket sitting in a room that did not belong to him, yet somehow did not seem out of place either. And for a moment, just a brief one, her expression softened, not completely, but enough to let something human slip through the controlled exterior. "And what would count as a reason?" she asked, her voice lower now, less guarded. And Marcus looked at her then, directly, his eyes calm, grounded. "When it stops being just a job," he said, and the words landed heavier than their simplicity suggested, settling into the space between them like something neither of them had expected to hear, and she leaned back slowly, absorbing that, her fingers tapping lightly against her knee once, twice, before going still again. The clock on the wall remained unmoving, the second hand frozen in place as if time itself had decided to wait, and in that stillness, something quiet but undeniable began to shift, not in the room, not in the job, but in the way she was starting to see him. Not as a variable in a controlled situation, but as something far less predictable. She did not respond right away, and that silence felt different now, not empty but active, like she was turning something over in her mind, testing it from different angles the way people do when they are no longer certain of their first impression, her fingers resting lightly against her knee, no longer tapping, no longer restless, just still, and Marcus noticed that shift without staring at it. The way you notice a change in temperature more than you see it, subtle but real, outside the room. The faint hum of the building carried on, distant footsteps somewhere down the hall, a door closing far away. Reminders that the world was still moving even if this room seemed suspended in its own quiet. She glanced at the clock then, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if expecting it to betray something. But the second hand remained frozen, unmoving, and for the first time she seemed to register it not as design, but as intention. Her gaze flicked back to Marcus, sharper now, more focused. "You see that?" she asked, nodding slightly toward the clock, and he followed her glance for a moment before answering. "I did." His voice calm, unchanged, and she leaned forward just a fraction. "And that does not bother you?" There was a faint edge in her tone now, not irritation, not quite suspicion, but something closer to curiosity pushing against control. Marcus considered the question without rushing it. "It tells me this room is not meant to track time," he said, and she held his gaze, waiting for more, but he did not elaborate. He never did unless it was necessary, and that seemed to pull a small breath from her, like she had expected him to chase the thought further, to fill the space with theories or questions, but he did not. He let it sit, and something about that restraint made her shift in her seat again, this time more noticeably. She reached into her bag then, pulling out a small leather wallet, smooth, expensive, the kind that did not get worn down easily, and as she opened it, a folded stack of cash slipped loose and fell to the floor between them, landing with a soft, unmistakable sound. It was not dramatic, not exaggerated, just enough to be seen, enough to be noticed, and Marcus saw it. Of course he did. But his eyes did not move immediately. He did not reach, did not react. He simply stayed where he was, as if the moment had not demanded anything from him yet. She watched him closely now, every detail, every breath, waiting for something. Anything. A flicker of instinct, a shift in posture, a glance held too long. But nothing came. Marcus remained still, his attention resting somewhere neutral, not avoiding the money, not acknowledging it either, just present, and that absence of reaction stretched longer than she expected, long enough for the weight of the situation to settle differently than she had planned. She cleared her throat softly, as if to reset the moment, then bent down to pick up the cash herself, her movements slower this time, less precise. And when she sat back up, she did not tuck it away right away. Instead, she held it loosely in her hand. "That could have been yours," she said, her voice quieter now, less certain of its direction. Marcus glanced at the money briefly, then back at her. "It was never mine," he replied, simple, direct, and she studied him again, searching for something beneath the words, some hidden angle, some performance. But there was none, just a man stating a fact as he saw it, and she leaned back slowly, the leather of the chair barely making a sound beneath her. "Most people would at least hesitate," she said, almost as if she was thinking out loud, and Marcus gave a small nod. "Hesitation usually means they are deciding who they want to be in that moment," he said, and that landed somewhere deeper than she expected, her grip on the cash tightening slightly before she finally slipped it back into her wallet, her eyes not leaving his face this time. And for a moment, just a brief one, the distance she had been holding between herself and everything else in the room seemed to thin, like a wall she had built out of habit had developed a small, quiet crack, not enough to break, not enough to fall, but enough to let something unfamiliar pass through, and the room, still silent, still unchanged, no longer felt like a place she controlled completely. The shift did not come with a sound, not at first, but it was there, subtle as a breath held too long. The way her shoulders no longer carried the same rigid control, the way her eyes lingered not to evaluate but to understand, and for someone like her, that difference mattered more than anything spoken out loud. She leaned forward again, this time without calculation, her elbows resting loosely on her knees, fingers interlaced as if she had forgotten the role she was supposed to be playing, or perhaps had grown tired of it. "You said something earlier," she began, her voice softer now, less sharpened by intent, "about a job becoming more than a job." She paused, searching his face, not for weakness but for something real. "What does that look like to you?" Marcus did not answer immediately, not because he did not have one, but because he treated questions like that with the same care he gave everything else. He let them settle, gave them space to mean what they were supposed to mean, and then he spoke. "It looks like responsibility," he said simply, and she tilted her head slightly. "Waiting?" Not the kind you are paid for, he continued. The kind you carry whether someone is watching or not. And something in that phrasing caught her off guard. Not because it was complicated, but because it was not. It was too clear, too grounded to be dismissed or reinterpreted into something safer. She exhaled slowly, leaning back again, her gaze drifting for a moment to the still clock on the wall, then back to him. And you think most people do that? She asked, her tone quieter, almost reflective now. Marcus gave a small shrug. I think most people want to, he said. But wanting and doing are not the same thing. And the room fell into silence again. But this time it felt less like tension and more like space. Space for something to land, to take shape without being rushed. She looked down at her hands then, as if noticing them for the first time. The faint impression left by the grip she had held on her wallet earlier, and she flexed her fingers slowly, releasing something she had not realized she was holding. You do not seem surprised by any of this, she said after a moment, her voice steady but carrying a question underneath. Marcus glanced around the room briefly, taking in the details without attaching to them. I have been in rooms where things did not make sense before, he replied. You learn to stay the same, even when the room does not. And that line settled deeper than the others, not because it was louder, but because it was lived, and she felt it, not as an idea, but as something that pressed gently against the walls she had built around herself. She shifted. Again, this time leaning back fully into the chair, her posture no longer guarded but not entirely open either, somewhere in between. And what if the room is testing you? She asked, the question slipping out before she could refine it. And for the first time since she had entered, there was something close to honesty in her tone, something unpolished. Marcus met her gaze evenly. Then it is not really about the room, he said, and she frowned slightly. What do you mean? She asked, and he held her eyes for a second longer, just enough to make sure she was listening for the right reason. If you only do the right thing when you think you are being tested, he said, then you are not choosing it. You are reacting to it. And the words did not hit hard. They did not need to. They simply settled, quiet and unavoidable, and she felt them, not as judgment, but as something she could not easily move around. Her lips parted slightly as if to respond, but nothing came, not immediately. Because for once, the answer she was looking for was not something she could control, and the silence that followed was no longer something she was observing. It was something she was inside of, fully, without. The distance she had relied on before, and across from her, Marcus remained exactly as he had been, steady, present, unchanged, not waiting for her to understand, not needing her to, just there, in a room that had stopped pretending to be neutral. The silence lingered longer this time, not because neither of them had anything to say, but because something had already been said that could not be easily undone, and Evelyn felt it settling somewhere deeper than she expected, not as a challenge, not as resistance, but as a quiet disruption to the way she usually moved through conversations, through people, through control. She shifted her gaze away from Marcus for the first time since the last exchange, letting it rest on the far wall where nothing was displayed, just a smooth surface reflecting the soft ambient light. And for a moment she seemed to forget why she had come into the room the way she had, with intention, with structure, with a plan that now felt thinner than it had an hour ago. She reached for the glass of water again, this time without hesitation, taking a longer sip, as if grounding herself in something simple, something real, and when she set it down, she did not place it precisely where it had been before, just near enough, and that small lack of precision spoke louder than any admission could have, Marcus noticed. But as always, he did not react. He allowed her the space to move without making her aware of it, and that absence of pressure gave her something unfamiliar, room to be unguarded without being exposed. She leaned back slowly, her head resting lightly against the back of the chair, eyes closing for just a second longer than a blink. And when they opened again, they carried less calculation, less distance. You ever get tired of it? She asked, her voice lower now, stripped of the earlier layers, and Marcus looked at her, not confused, but attentive. Of what? He asked, and she let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh at herself. Being steady, she clarified. Being the same, no matter what the room throws at you. And there it was, not a test, not a setup, but something closer to a real question. And Marcus did not rush his answer. He let it sit between them, letting her hear the weight of it before he placed anything on top of it. Sometimes, he said finally, his voice calm, but carrying something deeper now. But being something else usually costs more. And she frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition, like she understood that answer more than she wanted to admit. Costs what? She asked, her tone almost careful now. And Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, not uncomfortable, just adjusting. Costs the part of you that knows who you are when no one else is around, he said, and the words did not land loudly. They did not need to. They settled into the room like something that had always been there, just unnoticed until now, and Evelyn felt it, not as a revelation, but as a reminder of something she had pushed aside a long time ago. Her gaze dropped again, this time not to avoid him, but to follow the thought inward, her fingers tracing lightly along the edge of the chair, as if grounding herself in the present. And you never lose that? She asked quietly, and for the first time, Marcus did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because the question deserved honesty, not simplicity. You can, he said after a moment, if you stop paying attention. And she nodded slowly, almost to herself, absorbing that, letting it settle in a place she had not let anything reach in a while. The room felt different now, not just quieter, but more real, like the structure around it had faded just enough to let something human exist inside it. And for a brief moment, Evelyn did not look like someone in control of a situation. She looked like someone remembering what it felt like not to be, and across from her, Marcus remained unchanged, not distant, not detached, just present. The same quiet presence that had not shifted once since he walked into the room, and that consistency, more than anything else, was beginning to undo the assumptions she had built before he ever arrived. Something in the room had shifted beyond return, not dramatically, not in a way that could be pointed to or explained, but in the quiet spaces between their words, in the way Evelyn no longer seemed to be guiding the moment, but moving through it. And that loss of control did not show as panic. It showed as something rarer, something more fragile. She sat there for a while without speaking, her gaze unfocused, not on Marcus, not on the room, but somewhere inward, like she was walking through a memory she had not planned to revisit. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a weight that had not been there before. I used to think I understood people, she said, not looking. How do you know that? She asked, her voice steady but quieter now, and Marcus gave a small shrug, the kind that carried no need to convince. You do not, he said. You just choose how you show up anyway. And that answer did not satisfy the part of her that wanted certainty, but it spoke directly to something deeper, something she had not been listening to in a long time. She leaned forward again, elbows on her knees, mirroring that earlier posture without thinking. So you are saying it does not matter if someone is watching or not? She pressed, and Marcus shook his head slightly. It matters, he said, just not as much as people think. And the simplicity of it left no room for negotiation, no angle to work around, just something to sit with. And she did, for a long moment, the room quiet again, the clock still unmoving, the air steady, but inside that stillness, something had begun to shift in a way she could not easily reverse. She looked at him then, really looked this time, not as a variable, not as a subject, but as a person she did not yet understand. And that lack of understanding did not frustrate her the way it usually would. It grounded her. You do not ask many questions, she said after a while, her tone softer now, almost curious in a different way, and Marcus gave a faint smile, barely there. Not when the answers are not mine to take, he replied, and that line settled into her more deeply than she expected, because for the first time in a long time, she realized she had been asking questions not to understand, but to control, and sitting there, across from a man who was not giving her that control, she felt something unfamiliar, not discomfort, not resistance, but a quiet, steady awareness that this moment was no longer hers to design, and for reasons she could not fully explain, she did not try to take it back. The air in the room had changed in a way that could not be measured, not by the still clock, not by the quiet walls, but by the way Evelyn no longer seemed to be holding herself together with the same careful precision. Her posture relaxed in a way that would have been unthinkable when she first walked in. Her hands no longer anchored to objects, no longer searching for something to control, just resting, open, and that openness carried a kind of weight she was not used to feeling. She looked at Marcus again, but this time there was no calculation behind it, no silent checklist of reactions, just a question she had not prepared. "Do you ever feel like you are the only one not playing along?" she asked, her voice low, almost uncertain in a way that did not match the image she carried outside this room. And Marcus considered her words carefully, not rushing to fill the space, letting them sit as they were meant to. "Sometimes," he said, his tone steady. "But that usually means everyone else agreed on something I did not." And she let out a small breath at that, something close to understanding passing through her expression. "And that does not bother you?" she asked, her eyes searching his face not for answers, but for something she could recognize, and Marcus gave a slight shake of his head. "It used to," he admitted, "until I realized I was not responsible for what everyone else agrees to." And the simplicity of that statement landed deeper than it should have, not because it was complex, but because it stripped away something she had built her entire way of thinking around. She leaned back slowly, her gaze drifting upward toward the unmoving clock again. But this time she did not study it. She just looked, as if accepting that not everything in this room needed to explain itself to her. "I built systems to understand people," she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. "Frameworks, patterns, ways to predict how they would respond." She paused, her fingers brushing lightly against the armrest of the chair. "And it worked, most of the time," she added. Then her expression shifted slightly, not frustration, not disappointment, but something closer to realization. "But you are not responding the way you are supposed to." And Marcus met her gaze calmly. "Maybe I am not part of the system you built," he said, and there was no defiance in his voice, just a simple statement of fact. And she held that for a moment, letting it settle, because for the first time she could not categorize what was happening, could not place him into a predictable outcome, and instead of resisting that, she found herself leaning into it. "Then what are you doing here?" she asked, and the question carried something different now, not suspicion, not testing, but genuine curiosity. Marcus glanced briefly at the folded paper in his jacket pocket, then back at her. "The same thing I was told to do," he said. "I showed up." And that answer, simple as it was, seemed to shift something deeper in her, because it highlighted something she had not considered, that while she had designed every detail of this environment, he had simply stepped into it without trying to change it, without trying to control it, without trying to win anything from it. And that difference created a kind of imbalance she was not used to feeling. She leaned forward again, but this time there was no structure to it, no mirrored posture, just movement, natural, unplanned. "And if this was not just a job?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost careful, as if the answer mattered more than she wanted it to. And Marcus held her gaze, not for long, just enough. "Then I would still show up the same way," he said, and that was it. No elaboration, no attempt to make it sound better than it was, just a truth placed gently into the space between them, and Evelyn felt it settle, not as something to analyze, but as something to sit with, something that did not need to be tested to be real. And for the first time since she had entered that room, she did not feel like the one observing. She felt like the one being seen, not through questions, not through pressure, but through the simple, unchanging presence of someone who had not adjusted himself to fit her expectations. And that realization, quiet as it was, changed the way the room felt around her, no longer a place she controlled, but a place where something real had quietly taken hold. The moment did not announce itself, it rarely does, but something had reached its edge, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet point where continuing the same way was no longer possible, and Evelyn felt it before she fully understood it. The subtle shift from observing to deciding, from testing to revealing. She sat there for a second longer than necessary, her eyes resting on Marcus not as a subject, but as someone who had quietly dismantled the purpose she had brought into the room. And for the first time, she did not try to rebuild it. She let it remain broken. "This was never just a waiting room," she said finally, her voice steady but stripped of anything performative. And Marcus did not react, not with surprise, not with tension, just a slight pause in his breathing, the kind that acknowledged a change without needing to respond to it. She exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she had been holding since before she even walked in. "And you were not just hired to sit here," she continued, her tone calm, but carrying a truth she was no longer trying to hide. The words hung in the air for a moment, not heavy, just present, and Marcus nodded once. Not because he had figured it out completely, but because it made sense now. In a way that did not require explanation, she watched that nod closely, the lack of reaction, the absence of frustration or confusion, and it unsettled her more than any confrontation could have. Most people would be asking questions right now, she said, almost as if stating a fact she had built entire systems around, and Marcus gave a small, almost unnoticeable shrug. Most people expect something from a situation like this, he replied, and she tilted her head slightly. And you? Do not? She asked, and he looked at her calmly. I expect to leave the same way I came in, he said, and that answer landed differently than anything else he had said, not because it was complex, but because it removed her from the center of the equation entirely. She leaned back slowly, absorbing that, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the chair, grounding herself in something simple as the structure she had relied on continued to dissolve. You were being observed, she said. After a moment, more directly now, no longer circling around it. Every movement, every choice, every pause, she added, her voice even. But something underneath it had shifted, not pride, not control. Something closer to honesty. Marcus glanced briefly toward the ceiling, then back to her, not searching, not trying to confirm, just acknowledging. That makes sense, he said, and she let out a small breath, something between disbelief and acceptance. That is it? She asked, unable to hide the slight edge in her voice now. That is all you have to say? And Marcus met her gaze, steady as ever. You said it yourself, he replied. People act differently when they think they are being watched. He paused for just a second, letting the words settle before continuing. I did not think I was, and that was it. No defense, no attempt to impress. Just a simple truth placed exactly where it belonged. And Evelyn felt something inside her shift in a way she could not control, not because he had passed something, not because he had failed, but because he had never participated in the structure she built in the first place. She sat there in silence, longer this time, not searching for the next move, not calculating the next step, just sitting inside the realization that everything she had designed to understand people had been quietly bypassed by someone who was not trying to be understood, and for the first time, she did not see that as a flaw in him. She saw it as a limitation in herself, and that recognition, quiet as it was, changed the way she looked at him, not as a subject, not as a result, but as something she had not been measuring correctly all along. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence that filled the room was no longer something to navigate around. It was something to sit inside, something that carried the weight of everything that had just shifted without needing to announce it. Evelyn remained still, her posture relaxed in a way that no longer felt temporary, her gaze resting on Marcus not with expectation, not with analysis, but with a quiet recognition she had not anticipated when the night began, and Marcus, as he had been from the start, did not move to break that silence. He did not reach for words to close the moment or define it. He simply remained, steady, present, unchanged, and that constancy now meant something different than it had before. It was no longer just who he was. It had become something she had to understand. She let out a slow breath, almost imperceptible, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer than it had been at any point in the room. You were not supposed to do that, she said, not accusing, not confused, just stating something that no longer held the same authority it once did. Marcus tilted his head slightly, not questioning her words, just acknowledging them, and she gave a faint, almost amused shake of her head, as if recognizing the irony in her own statement. You were supposed to react, she continued, her eyes dropping briefly to the floor before returning to him. To hesitate, to adjust, to show me something I could measure. And there it was, not hidden anymore, not dressed in abstraction, just the truth of what she had been doing. And Marcus listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, not because he was unaffected, but because he had never stepped into that role to begin with. She leaned back slowly, her eyes drifting once more to the still clock, and this time she did not question it. She understood it, or at least she understood what it represented, a space where time, expectation, and outcome had been removed so something else could be observed, something more real, and yet that space had not given her what she thought it would. It had given her something she had not been looking for. She looked back at him, her voice quiet but clear. "You did not pass anything," she said. And there was no disappointment in it, no judgment, just a simple realization. Marcus gave a small nod, as if that confirmed something he had already known, and she allowed a brief silence to follow before adding, "You made it irrelevant." And that was the closest she came to acknowledging what had truly happened, that the system she had relied on had not been broken, it had simply been bypassed. She stood then, slowly, not with urgency, not with authority, just movement. And for a moment she remained where she was, looking at him as if there was something more she could say, something that would bring clarity or closure, but nothing came, because clarity had already arrived in a way she could not shape into words. Marcus stood as well, not because she did, but because the moment had shifted, and he recognized it without needing it explained. He reached for his jacket, sliding it on with the same quiet care he had shown all night, and she watched that simple action with more attention than anything else. The ease of it, the lack of performance, the absence of any need to be seen differently now that everything had been revealed. "You can go," she said finally, her voice steady, but softer than command. And Marcus gave a single nod, not asking what came next, not asking what any of it meant, just accepting the moment for what it was. He turned toward the door, his steps measured, unhurried, and as he reached for the handle, he paused for just a fraction of a second, not to look back, not to reconsider, just enough to acknowledge the space he was leaving behind. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, the quiet hum of the building returning to meet him as if nothing had changed. And maybe for the world outside, nothing had. But inside that room, Evelyn remained where she was, standing alone, her eyes still on the space where he had been. And for the first time in a long time, she was not thinking about what she had learned about someone else. She was thinking about what she had not understood about herself. The still clock on the wall unchanged, the room exactly as it had been, and yet something inside it had shifted in a way that would not reset. Not after this, not after him. And as the silence settled once more, it no longer felt